But I would say to the leaders of the Soviet Union and to their people that if either of our countries is to be fully secure, we need a much better weapon than the H-bomb. A weapon better than ballistic missiles or nuclear submarines, and that better weapon is peaceful cooperation. I believe, therefore, that the Soviet Union and the United States, together with their allies, can achieve further agreements. Agreements which spring from our mutual interest in avoiding mutual destruction. There can be no doubt about the agenda of further steps. We must continue to seek agreements on measures which prevent war by accident or miscalculation. We must continue to seek agreement on safeguards against surprise attack, including observation posts at key points. We must continue to seek agreement on further measures to curb the nuclear arms race by controlling the transfer of nuclear weapons, converting fissionable materials to peaceful purposes, and banning underground testing with adequate inspection and enforcement. We must continue to seek agreement on a freer flow of information and people from east to west and west to east. We must continue to seek agreement, encouraged by yesterday's affirmative response to this proposal by the Soviet foreign minister on an arrangement to keep weapons of mass destruction out of outer space. Let us get our negotiators back to the negotiating table to work out a practicable arrangement to this end. For plague and pestilence and plunder and pollution, the hazards of nature and the hunger of children are the foes of every nation. Has man had such capacity to control his own environment, to end thirst and hunger, to conquer poverty and disease, to banish illiteracy and massive human misery, we have the power to make this the best generation of mankind in the history of the world, or to make it the last. The science of weapons and war has made us all, far more than 18 years ago in San Francisco, one world and one human race with one common destiny. In such a world, absolute sovereignty no longer assures us of absolute security. The conventions of peace must pull abreast and then ahead of the inventions of war. 2 years ago, I told this body that the United States had proposed and was willing to sign a limited test ban treaty. Today, that treaty has been signed. It will not put an end to war. It will not remove basic conflicts. It will not secure freedom for all, but it can be a lever. And Archimedes, in explaining the principles of the lever, was said to have declared to his friends, "Give me a place where I can stand, and I shall move the world." My fellow inhabitants of this planet, let us take our stand here in this assembly of nations, and let us see that if we, in our own time, can move the world to a just and lasting peace.
60 years ago this month, my uncle John F. Kennedy made an historic speech at American University in Washington, D.C. And that speech was called the Peace Speech. And I'll give you some of the context for what was happening at that time. The previous autumn, he had been in the Oval Office with his science advisor, who I knew very well as a boy, and then growing up as well, Jerome Wisner. And at that time, I'm 69 years old, and I remember at that time the regular photographs on the cover of the New York Times and the other papers of atmospheric testing in the Pacific atolls. We were seeing the mushroom clouds of the atom bombs, the hydrogen bombs, and nitrogen bombs that were going off regularly in that part of the world. And that day, my uncle was meeting with Jerome Wisner and asking him he asked him at that meeting, what happens to the radioactive fallout? And Wisner said it circulates all around the globe very, very quickly, and then it drops back into the earth in the rain, and it gets into our fish, our animals, our ponds, our rivers, our streams, our drinking water. And it was raining at that time, and my uncle spent a long time staring out the window, and he said to Wisner, "Do you think it's in the rain that's falling right now?" And Wisner told him it was. And Ted Sorensen, who was in the room at that time and who had been with my uncle through some of the most difficult times in his life, mourning the death of his brother, and was with him when he almost died during his back surgeries, said that all the years that he knew John Kennedy, there was no time that he saw him more troubled than that day. And that launched a resolution where he decided he wanted to ban atmospheric nuclear testing. He knew his State Department would oppose it, and he knew the Pentagon was going to oppose it, so he did the whole thing secretly with Castro. By that time, they had set up the hotlines so they could talk directly with each other, but he negotiated the entire treaty through a few trusted aides within the White House and diplomats who were shuttling back and forth under the nose of the State Department. When they negotiated very, very quickly, and when he announced it to the United States, his State Department and the Pentagon were in revolt, open revolt. In fact, his Pentagon brass were lobbying Congress to kill this treaty by their boss, the Commander-in-Chief. And I think something like 80% of Americans initially opposed the treaty. And he was determined to get it passed. And this speech turned the country around. It was the beginning of a process that turned the whole country around. This speech and the whistle tour that followed it, where he went to places where he did not have political support. He went to the South, he went to the Western states, he went and gave speeches at the Mormon Tabernacle in Salt Lake, people who had not supported his presidency. But he found tremendous support on the ground from all Americans for making this happen, because as it turns out, the intelligence apparatus and the military brass wanted the war, but the American people did not, and they wanted an end to it. And with the speech, he did something extraordinary, something that had never been done before. To me, it's his most important speech. It's one of the most important speeches in American history. And the thing that he did that was so unusual in that speech is he talked to the American people and asked them to put themselves in the shoes of the Russians. Everybody else was doing the opposite at that time. They were demonizing and vilifying the Russians. And he said, no, we have to put ourselves in their shoes, in the shoes of our adversaries if we want to have peace. We need to do that. It has to be a regular discipline. And at that time, most Americans, the zeitgeist of that era, I was born 9 years after the end of World War II. And the zeitgeist of our era, the governing assumption was that America had won the war, and now we were going to rightfully dominate the peace. And he said something very, very different to Americans that challenged that sort of patriotic assumption. And he said, no, it was actually the Russians who won the war. They weakened Hitler and made it possible for us to march into Berlin. And he talked about the suffering of the Russians during the war and to legitimize their security concerns, which nobody was doing. Any show of military strength by the Russians at that time was portrayed as aggression. And what he was saying to the Americans is, no, they have legitimate security concerns the same as we do. And we need to understand those things. And he reminded Americans of the suffering that the Russians had endured during the war, the unimaginable suffering. 1 in 7 Russians had been killed during World War II. He said that, he asked Americans to imagine that all of the land, all of the cities, all of the towns from the East Coast to Chicago had been leveled to rubble, that the forests and fields had been burned. And he said that's what happened to Russia during the war. That's what they sacrificed for us.